The storm had arrived without warning, creeping in like an ominous shadow at the edge of the valley. It started with the faintest drizzle, barely a whisper of water falling from the sky, but the wind carried a chill, and the clouds began to darken as they gathered in heavy masses. No one had expected it to turn into something this catastrophic, and certainly no one had expected it to reach the wild Mustang that roamed the plains, untouched by the hands of men. Storm had been grazing near the river, his mane catching the breeze, his powerful frame standing tall against the flatlands. He was the embodiment of wildness, untamed, free, and relentless. Years of surviving the harshest conditions had only strengthened him. Droughts, storms, and predators had all come and gone. But this was something new, something he had never encountered before. The rain began to pour, heavier now, each drop pelting the earth with increasing intensity. The ground beneath his hooves softened, turning from dry and firm to a treacherous sludge. He knew something was wrong. His keen senses detected the change in the air, the weight of the storm settling over the land, the swelling power of the river that had always been a reliable boundary. Now the waters were rising, spreading quickly across the valley. The sound of rushing water soon filled the air, and for the first time the Mustang hesitated. He turned his head to the river, where the usually steady current had transformed into a dangerous, churning mass of water. He backed away, ears flicking nervously as the earth trembled beneath his hooves. The wind howled louder, and he instinctively moved toward higher ground, but the river had other plans. Without warning, the ground beneath him gave way. The earth beneath his hooves vanished as the floodwaters surged forward, and before he could react, the full force of the current ripped him from solid ground. His legs kicked desperately, trying to find purchase, but the water was too strong. The Mustang was no longer in control. He was at the mercy of the river, dragged relentlessly downstream. His heart pounded in his chest as his body fought against the chaos. Debris slammed into him, broken branches, tree trunks, and tangled brush crashing past him with brutal force. The Mustang's muscles burned as he struggled, the weight of the water pulling at him, threatening to drag him deeper into the flood. He kicked harder, but the water surged again, pulling him under. For hours, the Mustang fought for his life. His once powerful legs grew weaker, the cold creeping into his bones, his energy slowly slipping away with each passing second. His head bobbed above the water, struggling to stay afloat as his lungs screamed for air. His mind was clouded with exhaustion, but deep within him, a primal instinct kept him alive. He refused to give up. His body was battered. Each wave of water that hit him felt like a blow from a heavy hammer. His breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the water pressed against him, but still he fought. There was no choice. He couldn't let the flood win. Then a massive trunk of a tree came barreling toward him. The Mustang barely saw it in time. His exhausted body wasn't fast enough to avoid it. The log struck him with bone-shattering force, spinning him violently in the water. His legs went numb, and for the first time, he felt powerless. He was sinking. He tried to move, but his body didn't respond. His chest burned with pain, and the waters continued to pull him deeper into their grasp. His wide eyes locked onto the surface, but it was slipping farther and farther away. The Mustang's body thrashed weakly, but the current held him captive. "I can't die like this," he thought desperately. "I've survived worse than this." But as his strength waned, doubt crept in. The relentless floodwaters had become an unstoppable force. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could survive. His vision blurred, his body sinking into the depths. And then, just as he thought it was all over, something moved in the water. A figure, a flash of light through the darkness. Marco Johnson gripped the steering wheel of his truck, his knuckles white with tension. The storm had come on so fast, it felt like a nightmare unfolding before his eyes. The rain had been falling for hours now, and the valley had transformed into a flooded wasteland. The roads were disappearing beneath the rising waters, and all around him, familiar landmarks had turned into islands. His headlights cut through the downpour, casting an eerie glow on the flooded landscape. He had seen plenty of storms before, plenty of floods too, but nothing like this. The radio crackled beside him, and a voice came through, strained with urgency. "The roads are flooded. If you're still out there, get to high ground." Marco didn't respond. He didn't need to hear it. His gaze was fixed on the scene ahead, on the destruction that spread out like a river swallowing the valley. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing in on him, suffocating the world around him. Marco had spent most of his life running into danger. He'd been a soldier, a firefighter, a man who rushed into burning buildings, pulled people from wreckage, and carried the dead. It had cost him everything. He had seen enough death to last a lifetime, and he had sworn never to risk his heart again. But then he saw it. A flash of movement in the water. At first, he thought it was just another fallen tree swept away by the current. But then, it moved again. Something struggled, something alive. His heart skipped a beat. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the dark shape barely visible in the chaotic mess of floodwaters. It was a horse, a black Mustang struggling to keep its head above the water. His pulse quickened. His instinct screamed at him to look away. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't in a position to save anyone, not anymore. But then, the Mustang's head dipped below the water, and Marco's heart lurched. He couldn't ignore it. He slammed his truck into gear, throwing it into motion. The tires sliced through the floodwaters, and he sped down the submerged road. As he pushed forward, his mind screamed at him. "This is a mistake. You don't need this. You don't need to lose someone else." But his hand stayed tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched in determination. The Mustang's head appeared again, barely above the water. Its legs kicked weakly against the current, but it was clearly losing. And Marco knew that if he didn't act now, it would be too late. He could see it. The Mustang's wide, panicked eyes. The frantic desperation in its movements. It was struggling, but it wasn't going to make it. "I can't leave it like this. Not again." The flood was swallowing everything in its path, and Marco knew he couldn't turn back now. With each passing second, the Mustang's struggle became more desperate. His legs kicked, but the current was too powerful. He was running out of time. And then, Marco's truck roared through the floodwaters, the headlights flashing across the devastation. Marco was already out of the truck before it came to a full stop. The cold hit him like a punch in the gut, his boots slipping against the submerged ground as he tried to keep his balance. The water was waist-deep, icy, unforgiving. He didn't hesitate. He plunged into the flood, his muscles burning from the cold, the water pulling at him like claws. The Mustang was still there, barely keeping his head above the water, but the current was too strong. He was slipping under again. Marco gritted his teeth, moving forward through the water. He fought against the waves, the debris that slammed into him. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his breath ragged and sharp. He had done this before. He had pulled people from wreckages. He had saved lives. But this was different. The Mustang's eyes locked onto his, and for a fleeting moment, there was a connection, a silent plea for help. And in that moment, Marco knew that there was no turning back. He lunged forward, reaching out with his hand. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. His fingers brushed the Mustang's mane, slick with water. The horse's body thrashed in panic, and Marco felt his ribs take the brunt of a powerful kick. Pain exploded through his chest, and for a moment he was knocked back, the current pulling at him. But he didn't give up. He couldn't. He wouldn't let this Mustang drown. Not when there was still a chance. The Mustang's head bobbed beneath the water again. His lungs screamed for air. his limbs heavy, like they were made of stone. With each desperate breath, the weight of the flood pressed deeper into his chest. His mind was clouded, fading in and out of focus. The strength he had once known was now slipping away, his body shutting down from exhaustion. Yet, somewhere deep inside him, a fire still burned. He would not go under without a fight. Each wave of the current carried him farther from where he had once stood, and the flood had already taken so much from him: his footing, his ability to control his body. His once powerful muscles, honed over years of survival, were faltering, and the cold seeped into his bones, threatening to freeze him from the inside out. The log that had struck him felt like an iron chain, locking him in place. His vision blurred, and in the distance he thought he saw a light, a fleeting moment of hope, like the glow of a distant star. But the water, relentless and unforgiving, tried to pull him away. And then, just as his body began to feel weightless, a sudden force cut through the current. A strong arm reached out, grasping him by the mane, pulling him back to the surface. The Mustang's head broke the water, gasping for air, his wide eyes filled with a panicked recognition. There was someone. Someone was trying to save him. Marco's breath came in ragged gasps. His boots slipped against the slick rocks beneath the floodwaters, the icy current tugging at him, threatening to drag him under. The Mustang's body thrashed against him, disoriented, kicking out in sheer terror. Marco barely managed to stay on his feet, bracing himself with one hand on the submerged truck door, but his arm was locked around the Mustang's neck now, pulling him closer. He couldn't let go. He couldn't let this horse drown. The force of the Mustang's panic pushed Marco backward, sending a jolt of pain through his side. His ribs ached where the horse's hooves had struck him, but he didn't have time to worry about the pain. The Mustang was still alive, but barely. His legs kicked weakly, his eyes wide with fear, as if he knew the floodwaters were closing in. Marco's heart pounded in his chest. His lungs burned from the cold air, and the weight of the Mustang's body seemed to pull him down into the flood. He gritted his teeth, determination flooding through his veins. He couldn't think about the pain. He couldn't think about the exhaustion. All that mattered now was getting this horse to safety. Not today, Marco thought fiercely. You're not dying today. His legs burned as he moved forward, inching through the water. Each step was a battle, the current trying to pull them both deeper into the chaos. He could feel the Mustang's weight against him, his breath shallow and ragged. The horse wasn't fighting him anymore. It was as if the Mustang had given up, trusting Marco to pull him through this. A flood of memories surged through Marco's mind. His time as a soldier, his years as a firefighter, the countless times he had pulled people from burning buildings, saved them from the wreckage of car crashes. He had always been the one to run toward danger. He had always been the one who kept going, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much he wanted to stop. But those days were behind him now. He had sworn never to risk it again. Not after what had happened, not after losing too many people. But now, with the Mustang's life slipping through his fingers, Marco felt the old pull, the need to save. It wasn't just about the Mustang anymore. It was about him. It was about redemption, about healing. The current grew stronger as they moved forward, and Marco could feel himself slipping. His muscles screamed in protest, his breath coming in short, painful gasps, but he refused to stop. He couldn't. Not now. Ahead of them, there was a small patch of dry ground, a small rise in the land barely visible above the floodwaters. Marco knew they wouldn't make it if they didn't move faster. But the Mustang's legs were shaky, and he could feel the animal's weight growing heavier with each passing moment. "Come on, big guy," Marco muttered under his breath, his voice raw with exhaustion. "We're almost there." The Mustang let out a weak snort, his body trembling against Marco's chest. His legs were giving out. His breathing was shallow, slow, as though he didn't have the strength to keep going. Marco clenched his jaw, pulling harder on the makeshift lead that he had fashioned from barbed wire. The wire cut into his palms. But it was the only thing keeping them together, the only thing that gave him something to hold on to. Just a little farther, Marco thought, pushing himself forward with the last of his strength. He couldn't let go now, not when they were so close. The floodwaters surged around them, the current fighting against them, threatening to pull them both under. Marco's boots slipped in the slick mud, his legs buckling beneath him. The pain in his side was almost unbearable, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had promised himself he wouldn't let this horse die. He wouldn't let this be another failure. A massive wave hit them from behind, knocking both of them off balance. Marco's grip on the Mustang's mane slipped, and for a heart-stopping moment the Mustang's body was pulled away from him. The current was too strong, too relentless. Marco's stomach dropped as he lunged forward, reaching out with desperate hands. The Mustang was slipping beneath the surface again. His body was going under, and Marco's heart lurched. He couldn't lose him. Not now. He dove into the water after him, his arms flailing as the cold rushed over him. His lungs burned, his body numb from the freezing temperature, but he didn't stop. He had to get him. He had to save him. His fingers brushed the Mustang's mane again. He grabbed hold of it, his grip slipping and sliding in the rushing water. The Mustang's body was limp, his head submerged beneath the surface. Panic surged through Marco, but he refused to give in. He couldn't let go. With all the strength he had left, Marco pulled the Mustang back to the surface. His arms screamed with pain, his chest tight with the effort. The water was crashing against them, but they were alive. Both of them. Barely. The Mustang's eyes fluttered open, barely registering the world around him. His breathing was shallow, his body trembling against Marco's grip. He was exhausted, too exhausted to fight anymore. But he wasn't dead. He's not dead, Marco thought, a rush of relief flooding through him. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep going, but they had made it this far. They had survived, and that meant something. The land ahead was so close now, just a few more steps, and they would be out of the floodwaters. Just a little longer. Marco gritted his teeth, feeling the Mustang's weight pulling against him. He was struggling, his legs barely holding him upright, but they were so close now. One last push. Marco tightened his grip on the makeshift lead, pulling with everything he had left. The Mustang stumbled, his legs giving way as the current slammed into them, but Marco refused to stop. He pulled harder, every muscle in his body screaming in protest, but he wouldn't give up. Not now. The patch of dry ground was within reach. Marco's vision blurred, his body aching, but he could see it. The floodwaters were still rising, but there was safety ahead. There was hope. And with one final desperate lunge, Marco pulled the Mustang to solid ground. They hit the earth, both of them collapsing in exhaustion. The Mustang's body hit the ground with a heavy thud, his chest heaving in shallow breaths, but they had made it. Marco fell beside him, gasping for air, his entire body trembling with the effort. For a long moment they lay there, side by side, as the world around them continued to swirl in the chaos of the flood. The storm hadn't passed yet, but they were safe. For now. The Mustang's breathing was still ragged, his eyes half closed, but he wasn't sinking anymore. His body had stopped moving in fear. He wasn't fighting. He was alive. And so was Marco. They had survived. The Mustang lay still beside Marco, his chest rising and falling with shallow, laboured breaths. The storm still raged around them, the floodwaters swirling relentless in their pursuit. But for now, in this brief, fleeting moment, they were both safe. Marco's body was racked with exhaustion. His muscles screamed in protest as he lay on the ground, his ribs aching from the kick the Mustang had delivered earlier. His clothes were soaked through, heavy and cold, clinging to his body. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, mud, and the sharp tang of rain. Every breath felt like fire in his chest, and the chill of the water still seemed to seep into his bones. But he didn't care. They had made it. The flood had claimed so much of the land around them, but they had survived. They had both survived. Marco exhaled, his breath shaky as he lifted his hand, brushing it gently over the Mustang's sleek, wet coat. The Mustang shuddered beneath his touch, his muscles still trembling from the shock of the flood. Marco could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at him, but he refused to let his guard down. They couldn't stay here long. The water was still rising, the storm still howling in the distance. They needed to move. With a grunt of effort, Marco forced himself into a sitting position. He winced at the pain that shot through his ribs, but he ignored it. He had learned long ago that pain was just another obstacle to be pushed through. There were more important things now. "Come on, Storm," Marco murmured, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. He reached out, running his fingers through the Mustang's damp mane. "We've got to get you to dry ground." The Mustang lifted his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting Marco's with a faint glimmer of recognition. The horse's body was still heavy, too weak to move, but his ears flicked in response to Marco's words. There was a moment of stillness between them, a moment where the Mustang's gaze seemed to soften, a silent understanding passing between them. Marco's heart clenched at the thought. It wasn't just about saving the Mustang anymore. It was about something more, about the bond that had formed between them in those moments of struggle. In that brief instant, it was as if Marco had found something he had lost long ago, a reason to keep going. He exhaled slowly, his breath catching in his throat. He reached down, pulling the Mustang into a sitting position, the effort making his arms burn with fatigue. The Mustang swayed slightly, but Marco kept him steady. They couldn't stay in this patch of earth forever. They needed to move before the flood swept them away again. "Come on," Marco urged softly, the words more for himself than the Mustang. "Just a little farther. We can make it." With a final push, Marco managed to get the Mustang on his feet. The horse stumbled at first, his legs shaky, but he didn't fall. Marco wrapped his arm around the Mustang's neck, steadying him as they both stood there for a moment. The floodwaters were still rising, inching ever closer to the small patch of solid ground they stood on. There was no time to waste. Slowly, painstakingly, Marco began to guide the Mustang forward, his boots sinking into the mud as he moved through the waist-deep water. Each step was a struggle, against the current, against the exhaustion, and against the overwhelming fear that if they didn't make it soon, they wouldn't make it at all. The Mustang's hooves splashed weakly against the water, but they kept moving. Marco's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the task ahead of him pressing down on his shoulders. The current was relentless, pulling at them, trying to drag them back into the flood. But Marco kept his grip tight, pulling the Mustang forward with everything he had left. The flood was a monstrous thing, its power unfathomable, its reach endless. It had swallowed whole ranches, entire fields, homes and barns. Now it was coming for them, inch by inch, dragging everything in its path. But Marco refused to let it claim them. He gritted his teeth, his breath coming in short gasps. The storm had already cost him so much, but he wasn't going to let it take this too. He couldn't. Not when they were so close. He felt the Mustang's legs tremble beneath him, and he tightened his grip. The horse was weaker now, his energy fading with every step they took, but he kept moving. They were getting closer to safety, but Marco knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The floodwaters still raged around them, threatening to pull them under at any moment. The land ahead was so close, just a few hundred yards more, but the water seemed to grow deeper with each passing moment. The current was pushing against them, but Marco kept moving forward, one step at a time. The Mustang stumbled again, his legs faltering as he sank deeper into the mud. Marco's heart skipped a beat, fear surging through him like a wave. But he didn't let go. He couldn't. "Come on," Marco urged, his voice rough. "We're almost there." For a brief moment, the Mustang seemed to understand. He pushed forward, his legs quivering beneath him, his body dragging against the weight of the water. But then, with a final desperate step, he collapsed onto his side, his body sliding helplessly into the cold water. Marco's stomach dropped. His heart raced in his chest as he lunged forward, grabbing the Mustang's soaked mane once more. He pulled with all his strength, trying to keep the horse from going under. The current was too strong, too merciless. He couldn't let the Mustang be swept away. "Not today," Marco growled, his breath sharp in his chest. His muscles screamed in protest as he fought to lift the Mustang's body from the water. He wasn't going to lose him. Not now. He had come too far. They had come too far. With one final desperate push, Marco managed to drag the Mustang back to solid ground. His body was trembling with exhaustion, his arms numb from the strain, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The Mustang's chest heaved with shallow breaths, his legs still unsteady beneath him, but he was alive. He was alive. Marco collapsed beside him, gasping for air. His body ached from head to toe, the weight of the world pressing down on him. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had survived. The floodwaters still raged behind them, but they were no longer part of it. The Mustang let out a soft snort, his body still trembling, but there was something different now. Something changed. His body wasn't just fighting to survive. There was a glimmer of life in his eyes, a spark of strength that hadn't been there before. Marco's hand hovered over the Mustang's back, hesitant for a moment. The bond that had formed between them in those desperate moments was undeniable, unspoken but strong. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when the Mustang had stopped being a wild animal and had become something more, but it was there now. A connection forged in survival. "You're one hell of a fighter," Marco muttered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. The Mustang's ears flicked slightly in response, and Marco let out a tired chuckle. "Yeah, I guess we're both still standing." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world around them was silent. For the first time in hours, the only sound the distant rumble of the storm. The floodwaters had receded slightly, but the land was still submerged. The valley, a sea of destruction. Marco glanced around, searching for some sign of where they could go next. They couldn't stay here. The storm wasn't over yet. The Mustang shifted beside him, slowly pushing himself up to his feet. His legs were shaky, but he was standing again. Marco's heart swelled with relief. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep going, but they had made it this far. With a slow, deliberate movement, Marco got to his feet as well, his legs trembling with fatigue. He reached out, running a hand over the Mustang's back. The horse didn't flinch this time. There was no fear in his eyes. No fight left. They were in this together now. Marco exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "All right, Storm," he muttered, his voice soft but firm. "Let's go home." The Mustang stood beside him, steady and unafraid. Together they moved forward, toward whatever came next. There was still a long way to go, but they had each other. And, for now, that was enough. The path ahead was a blur of uncertainty, but it was a path nonetheless. Marco's steps were sluggish, heavy with exhaustion, but he pushed forward. His thoughts flickered through memories of battles, of fire and smoke, of lives he had tried to save, and some he had lost. The flood had brought it all back. The Mustang, with his fierce spirit and wild heart, was now more than a symbol of survival to Marco. He was a reminder that even when everything seems lost, there is always a chance for something to live on. The land was still submerged, the valley transformed into a chaotic web of water and debris. Trees had been uprooted, fence posts scattered like broken bones, and entire fields had been swallowed whole by the relentless floodwaters. The storm had ravaged everything in its path, leaving behind a silent landscape of devastation. Marco could feel his body protesting with every step, each movement slower than the last. His muscles burned, his ribs still aching from the impact of the Mustang's kick, and his heart was pounding with fatigue. But he kept moving, not just for himself, but for the Mustang beside him. They were in this together now. The Mustang's steps were shaky, his legs unsteady under the weight of exhaustion. But he walked beside Marco with a quiet determination. His coat, once sleek and shining, was now matted with mud and water, his dark eyes half-lidded, but filled with something that resembled trust. His body still trembled from the cold, but he kept pace, never faltering. The flood had changed everything. The Mustang had been wild, untamable, untouched by human hands. Now, he was reliant on Marco in a way neither of them had expected. But Marco wasn't sure how to process the bond that was forming between them. It wasn't the same as the bonds he had forged with other people. It wasn't a responsibility he had chosen, but it was real, undeniable. "Not so bad for a wild one, huh?" Marco murmured, glancing sideways at the Mustang. "I thought you'd be a lot harder to convince to keep going." The Mustang's ears flicked toward him, though his body was still heavy with weariness. It wasn't much of a response, but it was enough. Marco smiled, though it was tired and strained. It had been a long time since he had spoken to anyone like this, since he had allowed himself to make even the slightest connection. Maybe this was what he needed after all, someone or something to remind him that he wasn't alone. Ahead of them, the rising water still threatened, but it seemed to be holding steady for now. Marco kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for any sign of higher ground. There was a chance that further up the valley, the floodwaters would begin to recede completely. If they could make it there, they would be out of immediate danger. But the road was far from easy. The land they moved through was no longer the dry, open expanse that Marco had known. Every few steps, the Mustang's hooves would hit soft earth or muddy patches, causing him to stumble or slip. Each time, Marco would steady him, offering quiet encouragement, even as his own strength began to flag. The quiet, rhythmic sound of hooves striking the wet ground became a constant companion as they moved forward. The quiet moments between them felt like an eternity, the world around them swallowed by the relentless storm. The sound of the wind, the waves crashing against the land, the distant rumbles of thunder, all of it blurred into one constant background of noise that never ceased. But within this chaos, there was a rare stillness between Marco and the Mustang, an unspoken understanding that kept them moving step by step. For a while, they walked in silence, with only the sound of the water rushing past them. It wasn't until they reached a cluster of broken trees, their roots clawing at the earth in desperate grasp, that Marco spoke again. "You know, I used to be good at this," he said quietly. "Rescuing people, I mean." He glanced at the Mustang, who was still moving slowly but steadily beside him. "I thought I was done with it," Marco continued, his voice distant. "I've been running for so long, trying to outrun things I've seen, things I've lost." He paused, feeling the weight of his words, the weight of his history. "But I guess I've still got some fight left in me." He didn't expect the Mustang to respond, and the horse didn't, but there was something in his gaze now. It wasn't fear. It wasn't the wild, untamed spirit that had first caught Marco's attention. It was something quieter, something that spoke of survival, of a shared will to live, to keep moving despite everything. Marco turned his attention back to the path ahead. They were getting closer to higher ground, but there was still a long way to go. The flood had claimed so much, but it hadn't claimed them yet. "We're getting close," Marco muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a little longer." It felt like they had been walking for hours, though it had probably only been minutes. Time seemed to stretch, the exhaustion from the hours of fighting the flood taking its toll on him. He knew they couldn't rest yet. They couldn't afford to. The Mustang needed dry land, and he needed to keep moving. As they continued forward, the floodwaters began to thin, and the land rose in the distance. The ground was still muddy, but the trees that had once been swallowed whole were now visible again, their tops peeking out of the water like broken sentinels. The Mustang stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him for a brief moment. Marco's heart skipped a beat, and he moved quickly to steady him, holding the horse's neck and guiding him back onto solid footing. "Easy, Storm," Marco murmured. "We're almost there. Just hold on." The Mustang's head was low, his body dragging, but his eyes still held that spark of life. It wasn't the same fire that had kept him fighting the current, but it was enough. He was still with Marco, still willing to walk, still holding on. Marco could feel the bond between them growing stronger with each step. It wasn't just about saving the Mustang anymore. It was about the shared journey, the shared survival. The Mustang, in his quiet way, had reminded Marco of something he had forgotten. That the fight wasn't over as long as you kept moving forward. And together, they were moving forward. Not as a soldier and a wild animal, but as two survivors. By the time they reached the rise in the land, the floodwaters had receded enough to reveal the patch of dry ground Marco had hoped for. It wasn't much, but it was a refuge. It was enough for them to rest, enough to find some measure of safety. Marco's legs were shaking with fatigue as he guided the Mustang onto the solid earth. The land here was rough, covered in remnants of broken trees and debris, but it was dry. The flood had not reached this far. They were safe for now. The Mustang stood, still shaking with exhaustion, but he didn't collapse. He was finally able to find stable footing, though his legs were still unsteady. Marco led him to a fallen tree, its roots still grasping the earth like the outstretched arms of a long-forgotten giant. It would offer some shelter from the storm, at least temporarily. Marco sank down onto the muddy ground beside the Mustang, his body finally giving way to the exhaustion that had been building within him. He let out a long, tired sigh as he leaned back against the tree, his breath coming in heavy, uneven gasps. The storm was still raging, but they were no longer in immediate danger. They had made it. Marco looked up at the Mustang, who was standing quietly beside him. His breathing had slowed, his body no longer trembling from the cold, though the weight of exhaustion was still heavy on him. The Mustang's dark eyes met Marco's, and for a moment there was nothing but a shared understanding between them. They had both survived. They had both made it through something impossible. And now they would figure out what came next. Together. The storm was unrelenting, but the two survivors were finally out of its most dangerous grip. The floodwaters still surged in the distance, but the ground they stood on, while muddy and littered with the remnants of trees, felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos of the flood. The constant rumbling of thunder above was a reminder that nature was far from merciful, but for now, Marco and Storm were spared. Marco's body, fatigued from the hours of struggle, slumped further against the tree's roots, but he remained vigilant. His eyes scanned the horizon, still watching the floodwaters as they swirled, inching ever closer to their little patch of safety. The Mustang, though worn out and weary, remained beside him, his head lowered, ears flicking occasionally, as though sensing the stillness in the air. Marco's mind drifted again, as it often did when he was alone with his thoughts. It wasn't that he wanted to think about the past, but the events of the day had unlocked old memories that he had long tried to bury. He had been a soldier. He had been a firefighter. He had been the one to charge into the fire, the one who pulled people from wreckage and brought them to safety. But what had all that truly meant when the people you saved were no longer there? What had it meant when you couldn't save everyone? When you lost too much? The loss still felt fresh, even though years had passed. He had sworn to himself that he was done with saving people. No more rescues, no more putting his heart at risk. But here he was, alone in the storm, saving a horse, a creature he had no reason to care about, yet somehow he cared more than he had in a long time. The Mustang had reminded him of what it felt like to fight, to keep going even when there was no more strength left to give. The Mustang had reminded him that survival wasn't just about breathing, it was about living. "Guess I'm not done yet," Marco muttered under his breath, the words lost in the howling wind. He didn't know why he was talking out loud. Maybe he needed to hear the sound of his own voice, or maybe he just needed to admit something to himself. Whatever it was, he couldn't deny that this was different. Helping the Mustang wasn't just about saving a life. It was about saving his own. And as he looked at the horse beside him, still struggling to catch his breath but standing strong, Marco realized just how much that moment of connection had changed everything for him. The Mustang snorted softly, his breath warm against the cold air. Marco shifted his gaze to the horse, who was slowly inching his way toward him. It wasn't much of a gesture, but it was enough. The bond between them had grown stronger, more than just a human trying to save an animal. It had evolved into something more, something unspoken. "Yeah," Marco said with a small smile, though it was tired and worn. "I think you're the only one left that I can rely on." The Mustang's ears flicked toward him, and his dark eyes regarded Marco with what seemed like a mixture of curiosity and understanding. There was no fear now, no hesitation. The wild Mustang that had fought so fiercely against Marco's attempts to help him had become something else. And Marco, for all his struggle, had become something else too. He had let himself care. He had let himself fight. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. But even as he allowed himself to lean back against the tree, allowing a brief moment of respite, Marco knew that they couldn't stay here for long. The flood was still rising in the distance, and the storm had yet to show signs of abating. They were safe for now, but they had to move. There was no telling how much longer this small rise in the land would hold. He glanced at the Mustang again, his eyes moving over the animal's battered body. The flood had left its mark on him. His coat was matted with mud, his body drained from the fight, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. But despite it all, the Mustang stood tall. He wasn't broken. He wasn't giving up. And Marco wouldn't either. With a deep sigh, Marco pushed himself to his feet, his knees aching with every movement. His body screamed at him to rest, to give in to the fatigue. But he couldn't. Not yet. "Come on, Storm," Marco murmured, his voice rough from the cold. "We've still got a long way to go." The Mustang looked up at him, his dark eyes meeting Marco's with a quiet resolve. The bond between them wasn't just about survival anymore. It was something deeper, something harder to explain. They had been through hell together, and in that hell they had found each other. The Mustang was no longer just a wild animal in need of rescue. He was a partner, a companion, and Marco wasn't going to leave him behind. Marco took a step forward, carefully navigating the uneven ground. The Mustang followed, his hooves splashing weakly through the wet earth, his body moving slowly but steadily beside Marco. The flood waters had begun to recede slightly, but the land ahead was still a dangerous maze of debris and treacherous footing. The path they had to take wasn't going to be easy, but they didn't have a choice. As they moved forward, Marco could feel the weight of their journey pressing on him. Each step felt like a monumental effort, his body aching with each movement, but the Mustang didn't falter. His legs wobbled, yes, but he kept moving, one hoof in front of the other, his pace matching Marco's. Marco glanced over at him again. The Mustang's ribs were visible beneath his wet coat, his body frail from the exertion of the flood. But his spirit was still there, alive and burning. He wasn't giving up, and that reminded Marco that he couldn't either. They had come too far. They had survived too much. There were moments when Marco wasn't sure how they were still standing. He wasn't sure how he was still moving, let alone guiding the Mustang through the floodwaters. But every step they took seemed to bring them closer to something, closer to safety, closer to dry land, closer to the end of this nightmare. Finally, after what felt like hours of trudging through the muck and debris, they reached a small rise in the land. The water was still high in the valley below, but here, on this small patch of solid ground, the floodwaters had receded. The land was dry, if not entirely stable, but it was dry enough for them to rest. Marco's legs were shaking with exhaustion as he helped the Mustang up the rise. His chest ached, his ribs sore from the effort of holding onto the horse during the worst of the flood. The Mustang, too, was shaky but standing. Both of them were battered and bruised, but they were here. They had made it. "Good boy," Marco murmured, reaching out to touch the Mustang's neck. The horse didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, as if he too was acknowledging their survival. Their shared journey. The storm had not relented, but the rain had begun to taper off. The wind had died down, and for the first time in hours, the air felt still, as though the earth itself was taking a moment to breathe. The valley ahead was a broken landscape, trees torn from their roots, fields swallowed by the water. It would take time for the world to recover from what had happened, but for now, they were alive. Marco exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the Mustang's side. The horse's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, but he was standing. He had survived. They both had. "Let's just rest for a while," Marco muttered, his voice rough. "We've earned it." And for a while they did. They sat together on the small rise, the Mustang beside Marco, as they both took a moment to recover. The world around them was quiet now, the worst of the storm behind them. But there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. The flood had claimed so much, but it hadn't claimed them. As they rested, the sky above began to clear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Marco let himself relax. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. He glanced down at the Mustang, who had settled beside him, his head lowered, eyes half closed in exhaustion. They had made it through the worst of it, and though the future was still uncertain, they had each other, and that, in itself, was something worth fighting for. As the hours passed, the storm finally began to dissipate, though the ground around Marco and Storm remained slick and muddy. The heavy rains had stopped, but the sky was still a heavy grey blanket, threatening to unleash more at any given moment. Marco glanced at the Mustang. Despite the floodwaters receding, the exhaustion in the horse's legs was palpable. His body, worn down from the violent struggle against the flood, was too frail to continue walking much farther without care. Storm had survived the worst of it, but there was no telling how much longer he could last without some form of help. The veterinarian's office was a distant hope in this barren landscape, a small outpost that was nearly a day's journey away. Marco knew he couldn't wait any longer. The Mustang needed treatment. His ribs were showing beneath his soaked coat, and there were cuts and bruises all over his body. If Marco had learned anything over the years, it was that survival wasn't just about getting through the storm. It was about taking care of what came after. "All right, Storm, let's get you somewhere safe," Marco muttered, his voice hoarse but determined. "I know you're tired, but we have to keep going. A little farther." The Mustang seemed to understand, his ears flicking toward Marco. His steps were slower now, but they were deliberate. He leaned into Marco's touch, as though the bond between them had solidified in those quiet moments when they sat together on the small rise. Marco had never been one to believe in fate, but something about this situation made him think otherwise. He had come into this storm knowing he was running away from his past, seeking distance from the weight of his own emotions. But now he was on a path he hadn't planned for. A path that involved a wild horse, one that had once been untamed, running free, and now was depending on him. It wasn't just the Mustang that needed saving anymore. The journey ahead was fraught with challenges. The path to the veterinary office was filled with obstacles. Fallen trees, mudslides, and the remnants of the flood that had taken over the land made it almost impossible to traverse. Marco found himself constantly looking for new routes, for ways to avoid the worst of the flooded ground. As they moved through the increasingly difficult terrain, Marco couldn't help but notice how much weaker the Mustang seemed with each passing hour. He'd been strong. He had fought the flood with everything he had. But now he was dragging his hooves through the mud, his once mighty muscles trembling with the effort. Marco's own body was no better off. His muscles screamed for rest, his ribs aching from the force of the Mustang's kicks earlier. But there was no time for weakness. He couldn't afford to stop now. Not when the Mustang was relying on him. They reached a creek where the water had only just begun to recede, leaving behind a narrow stretch of land that had yet to be swallowed by the flood. Marco took a deep breath and guided the Mustang forward. The horse stumbled, his legs too weak to keep him upright, but Marco held him steady, refusing to let him fall. There was a veterinary clinic ahead, a few more miles to the north, but it felt like they were still too far away. But then, something unexpected happened. As Marco guided Storm forward, the Mustang's legs buckled, and he fell to his knees with a harsh grunt. Marco's heart lurched as the horse collapsed completely, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. "No, no, no," Marco muttered, dropping to his knees beside the horse. He ran his hands over the Mustang's shoulders, feeling the trembling muscles beneath his coat. "You've come this far? Don't give up now." The Mustang looked up at him, his dark eyes wide with pain and confusion. He was barely holding it together, and Marco could see the fight draining out of him. Marco's breath caught in his throat. He needed to get him to the clinic. But how? They were miles away, and the Mustang was too weak to move. His mind raced. He glanced around, his eyes catching on a large fallen tree near the edge of the creek. It was sturdy, its branches spread wide enough to form a crude shelter. It wasn't much, but it would offer some protection from the elements. He made a quick decision, his heart pounding. "Stay with me, Storm. I'm going to get help. Just hang on." With a steadying hand on the Mustang's neck, Marco stood, taking one last look at the clinic's direction, knowing it was too far to go on foot. He wasn't sure how much longer the Mustang could last without treatment, but he had to try. He pulled his phone from his pocket, and after a brief moment of panic, realizing there was little to no service in this remote area, he adjusted his position, moving slightly down the creek's embankment. He tried again, desperately seeking any kind of signal. It wasn't long before the connection finally came through, and the familiar ringing tone filled his ears. "Hello?" a voice answered, rough and distant. "This is Marco Johnson. I'm on the outskirts of the valley. My horse, my Mustang, he's in bad shape," Marco said quickly, his voice tight with urgency. "I need help. He's been through the flood and he's too weak to move. Please, we need to get him to a veterinary clinic." "Where exactly are you?" the voice on the other end asked, sounding more alert now. "I'm near the creek, north of here, near the last floodwater mark. There's a clinic. I'm not sure how far, but we're almost there. But he's in bad shape." "I'm on my way," the voice replied, with a sense of professionalism that instantly calmed Marco's racing thoughts. "Hold tight. I'll be there as quickly as I can." Marco exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging with relief. The Mustang wasn't alone in this anymore. He had made the call. Help was on the way. "Hang in there, buddy," Marco whispered, dropping to the ground beside the horse again. He stroked Storm's mane gently, trying to comfort him as best he could. The Mustang's breathing was ragged, his eyes closing as he lay there, shivering despite the warm, humid air. The next hour dragged on like an eternity. Marco sat beside the Mustang, watching as the horse struggled to stay awake, his body trembling with weakness. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed was a reminder of everything they had been through. Marco thought back to the times he had been in situations like this before, when he had felt as though he was completely alone. The flood had taken so much from him, but this bond with the Mustang, was something he hadn't expected. The two of them, both battered by life, had found each other, and that meant something. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence, and Marco stood up quickly, his heart leaping in his chest. A truck pulled up along the creek's edge, a familiar figure jumping out. "I've got the vet," the man called out as he made his way toward them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that looked weathered and worn from years of fieldwork. "I'm Dr. Smith. Let's take a look at this fella." Marco stepped aside as the veterinarian knelt beside the Mustang, carefully inspecting the horse's legs and ribs. "He's been through a hell of a lot, Dr. Pastor do 11.11.11.11, Smith said, his voice calm but filled with concern. "He's weak, dehydrated, and I can see some abrasions from the debris, but it's nothing we can't work with." Marco nodded, his breath still shallow with relief. "How long until he's stable?" "We'll need to get him back to the clinic. We'll get some fluids into him, treat the cuts, and do a full assessment. I'll need to keep him under observation for a while, but he'll make it through." Marco's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you." Dr. Smith smiled faintly. "You're not the first to fight for a horse, and you won't be the last. We all have our moments when we need help. Just make sure you stick around to give this guy the support he needs." Marco chuckled softly, wiping a hand across his face. "I'm not going anywhere." The Mustang stirred slightly, his eyes flicking toward Marco. For a moment, the two of them just shared a look, one that said more than words ever could. Together, they had survived. And together, they would keep fighting, one step at a time. The hours that followed were a blur of careful movement, the sound of the Mustang's breathing steadying as he was loaded into the back of the truck, his injured body tenderly handled by Dr. Smith and his team. Marco, though exhausted and emotionally drained, climbed into the front of the truck, watching intently as the horse's form was tucked in carefully. He could still hear the sounds of the storm in his mind, the crashing of the water against the land, the panic in the Mustang's eyes, the wild struggle. But now, at least for a moment, there was calm. Dr. Smith, who had been a familiar face in the community for years, had quickly gotten a handle on the situation. He was a man of few words, preferring action over reassurance, but Marco appreciated that. There was something comforting about knowing that the Mustang was in capable hands. As they drove, the landscape passed in a blur of muddy fields and trees stripped bare by the flood. The devastation was vast. Homes were submerged, barns flattened, fences and pastures destroyed, but Marco couldn't focus on it. He wasn't sure how long the drive had taken before they reached the clinic. His thoughts kept drifting to the Mustang. The moments of panic were still fresh. What if it had been too late? What if the flood had taken more from the horse than he could recover from? His eyes flickered over to the back of the truck, where the Mustang was resting now, bandaged and calm, but still weak. Dr. Smith had done his best to stabilize him, administering fluids and taking care of the cuts that the Mustang had sustained during his fight against the current. He was still breathing heavily, his body tense from the trauma, but there was no immediate sign of anything life-threatening. The Mustang was alive, and that was what mattered. Finally, the truck came to a halt, pulling up to the clinic. It was a small, modest facility located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields that had been drenched by the rain. The clinic was built to withstand weather like this, tough, sturdy, and reliable. As Marco stepped out of the truck, his legs wobbled with exhaustion. He hadn't realized just how much the adrenaline of the rescue had kept him moving, kept him going. Now the weight of the day seemed to come crashing down, and all he wanted to do was rest. But the Mustang still needed him. Dr. Smith motioned for Marco to follow him as the team unloaded the Mustang from the truck and guided him into the clinic. "He's in good hands now. We'll get him settled in and monitored overnight," the vet explained as they moved through the building. The clinic was filled with the smells of antiseptic and hay. The steady hum of machines in the background mixed with the occasional whinny or neigh from the other animals being cared for. The clinic wasn't large, but it was well equipped, one of the best in the area, despite its humble exterior. The team of veterinarians and nurses moved with practiced efficiency, preparing a stall for the Mustang, setting up IV drips, and checking him over for further injuries. Marco stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. The Mustang's weary eyes met his, and for a brief second there was a flicker of recognition between them. The connection that had been forged in the flood was undeniable. They had both survived against the odds, and it wasn't just a matter of the Mustang needing help anymore. It was a bond of survival. They had shared something that couldn't be easily broken. "You should go get some rest," Dr. Smith said, noticing Marco's exhausted posture. "We'll take care of him here. I'll keep you updated on his progress." Marco nodded, though he didn't want to leave. His heart ached as he watched the Mustang being carefully settled in, but he knew the best thing he could do right now was to rest. He had pushed himself beyond his limits, and the Mustang would be okay for a few hours without him. The clinic staff would keep watch, and he could come back in the morning to check on him. He had to trust them. "I'll be here first thing in the morning," Marco said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Smith nodded, understanding the unspoken commitment. "I'll make sure he gets everything he needs. You've done a lot today. You deserve some sleep." But sleep didn't come easily. Marco's mind was restless. He found himself lying in a small motel room, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts spinning. He couldn't shake the image of the Mustang's eyes, the fear, the exhaustion, the way the horse had collapsed, unable to go any farther. The way he had been so willing to trust Marco in those final moments of the flood. It wasn't just the horse that had been saved. It was something inside Marco, something he had buried for so long. The pain, the trauma, the loss, it all came rushing back in those moments of crisis. He had tried to outrun it, tried to shut it out. But in the flood, in the storm, he had found something he hadn't expected, a chance at redemption, at healing. The Mustang had reminded him of his own strength, of his own ability to fight, even when everything seemed lost. Marco turned over in bed, his mind still racing. He thought about his past, about the people he had saved, and the ones he hadn't. He thought about the things he had lost, and the way he had run from it all. The Mustang had reminded him of who he used to be, someone who fought for others, someone who cared. The sound of a phone ringing broke through his thoughts, and he reached over, fumbling to pick it up. It was Dr. Smith. "Marco," the vet's voice came through the receiver. "I just wanted to update you on Storm." Marco's heart skipped a beat. "How is he?" he asked, sitting up in bed. "He's stable for now," Dr. Smith replied, his voice steady but with an edge of caution. "We've got him on fluids and antibiotics, and his vitals are improving. He's still weak, very weak, but I think he'll pull through. The cuts and bruises will take time to heal, but nothing seems life-threatening." Marco exhaled a long breath of relief. He had been holding on to that moment of fear, waiting to hear the worst. But the news was good. The Mustang had a chance. He would make it. "That's good news," Marco said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you, Dr. Smith. I'll be there first thing tomorrow." "You're welcome. Get some rest. He'll still be here when you get back." As the call ended, Marco felt a wave of exhaustion crash over him. He had done what he could. The Mustang was in good hands. Now, he had to allow himself to let go, to trust that the fight wasn't over just yet. He lay back down, closing his eyes, knowing that the next chapter was just beginning. The next morning came quickly. Marco woke to a dull ache in his body and the soft sounds of the world outside, a world that had been forever changed by the storm. He showered, dressed, and headed out, the sense of anticipation heavy on his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected when he arrived at the clinic, but the thought of seeing the Mustang, alive, breathing, and with a fighting chance, kept him moving forward. When he arrived at the clinic, he was greeted by Dr. Smith, who led him to the stall where the Mustang was resting. The horse was still lying down, his breathing more controlled, his body looking less frail than the night before. His wounds were bandaged, and though he looked worn out, there was a spark of life in his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. "You've done a lot for him," Dr. Smith said quietly as they watched the Mustang. "He's a fighter, just like you." Marco nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "We've both been through hell, but he's still here." Dr. Smith smiled faintly. "He's got a good chance of making a full recovery. We'll keep monitoring him, but he's strong. You've given him the best shot." Marco watched the Mustang for a moment longer, before stepping closer to the stall. He rested his hand on the bars, his eyes meeting the horse's. There was no need for words. The Mustang knew. They both knew. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. "All right, Storm," Marco whispered softly. "Let's get you back on your feet." The Mustang turned his head slightly, his ears flicking in acknowledgement. Together, they would keep fighting. Together, they would find a way forward. And this time, Marco wasn't running. The days that followed were a slow, methodical process of recovery for both the Mustang and Marco. The first few hours after the Mustang's arrival at the clinic were critical. But, as Dr. Smith had assured him, Storm was a fighter, and after being given fluids, a warm, stable, and careful medical attention, the Mustang's condition slowly began to improve. His fever broke, and his breath became less labored. The wounds on his body, while still raw, showed signs of healing, and his strength was gradually returning. Marco spent the next few days in the clinic, coming in the morning and staying through the late afternoon. Every day he'd sit by the stall, watching Storm rest, his eyes flicking over the horse's body, inspecting his wounds and making sure there was no sign of infection. He didn't speak much, but the bond between them was growing stronger. The Mustang had stopped flinching when Marco approached. Instead, he'd nuzzle Marco's hand in acknowledgement, a quiet gesture that spoke volumes. In those quiet moments, Marco thought a lot about his life. He had spent so many years running away from responsibility, from the pain of loss. He had avoided getting close to anyone because he was afraid of losing them. But here, with this horse, this wild creature who had been as close to death as anyone could be, he had found something. Something he thought he had lost forever. Storm wasn't just an animal to Marco anymore. He was a partner. A living reminder that even in the darkest moments there was a way forward, a way to keep fighting. One morning, as Marco arrived at the clinic, Dr. Smith pulled him aside with a serious expression. "Marco, I need to talk to you for a minute," the vet said, motioning for him to follow into the back office. Marco's heart skipped a beat. "What's wrong? Is something wrong with Storm?" "No, nothing like that," Dr. Smith said, sitting down behind his desk. "I just wanted to discuss the next steps. His physical recovery is going well, but there's something else we need to talk about." Marco took a seat across from the vet, anxiety gnawing at him. "What's going on?" Dr. Smith leaned forward, his eyes meeting Marco's. "The thing is, Storm's not a horse that's going to just go back to grazing in a pasture. He's been through too much, and it's going to take more than physical recovery for him to regain his spirit. His trauma from the flood, and everything he's been through, it's deep. Horses like him need a gentle transition. They need time to reacclimate, and they need a specific kind of care. Marco nodded slowly, his mind racing. He hadn't considered the emotional toll the flood had taken on Storm. It made sense. He had watched the Mustang fight like a warrior, but he also saw the toll it had taken on him. The horse wasn't just physically beaten. His spirit had been broken, too. "I don't have the means to help him the way he needs, Dr. Cannon," Smith continued. "There's a stable about 3 hours from here, just outside of the city. They specialize in working with wild horses. It's a long process, but they have the right facilities and the experience to rehabilitate horses like Storm. They work with animals that have been traumatized, animals that need time to learn to trust again." Marco sat back in his chair, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He had come so far with Storm, and now he was being asked to let him go again. Let someone else take over. It felt like a betrayal, even if it was the right thing to do. "I can't just hand him off like that," Marco said quietly, more to himself than to Dr. Smith. "I've been with him through this whole thing. I can't just walk away now." Dr. Smith's face softened with understanding. "I'm not asking you to walk away, Marco, but the truth is, you can't do everything for him. You've already done so much. And right now, what Storm needs most is space, time, and professional help. The kind of help you can't provide on your own, no matter how much you care." Marco sat in silence, the decision weighing on him. He had already given so much to the Mustang. He'd risked everything to pull him from the floodwaters. But letting him go now felt like tearing apart something that had just started to heal. But deep down, he knew Dr. Smith was right. Storm had been through so much more than Marco had ever faced. He deserved the best chance at a full recovery, and that was something only the specialists at the rehabilitation center could give him. With a heavy heart, Marco nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll take him there, but I'll be back. I'll check in every day." Dr. Smith gave him a reassuring smile. "That's the right decision, and we'll make sure Storm gets the care he needs." The next few hours passed in a blur. Marco packed up the Mustang's things, gathering the supplies Dr. Smith had given him, and took a long, final walk with Storm through the clinic. The Mustang was still weak, but was able to stand on his own. His movements were slow, cautious, but there was a spark in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that they were about to embark on another journey together. As Marco guided the Mustang into the back of the trailer, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was saying goodbye, even though it was far from the end. The Mustang needed this. He needed the space, the time to heal. And maybe, just maybe, Marco needed this too. He had come so far with Storm. Perhaps the time had come to let him take the next step on his own. The ride to the rehabilitation center was long, and Marco didn't speak much along the way. The sound of the trailer's tires on the road was the only noise in the truck. Storm stood quietly in the back, his head resting against the sides of the trailer, looking out the small window. He was still tired, still recovering, but he was alive, and he was going to make it. When they finally arrived at the facility, Marco was greeted by a kind-faced woman in her early 40s. She introduced herself as Diane, one of the lead trainers at the rehabilitation center. She had a calm energy about her, and Marco felt an instant sense of trust as she approached him. "Thank you for bringing him here," she said gently. "He's in good hands now. We specialize in horses like him. Horses that have been through something traumatic. He'll be given the time he needs to adjust." Marco's chest tightened at the thought of leaving Storm here. But Diane's words were comforting. The facility was beautiful, surrounded by open fields and dotted with barns and paddocks. The horses seemed calm, and Marco saw firsthand how they interacted with the caretakers, gently, patiently. This was a place of healing, of recovery. The Mustang stepped out of the trailer, slowly at first, his legs still unsteady. Diane and her team moved carefully to help him settle into a stall. Marco stood by, watching as the team expertly guided the Mustang, providing him with the space and gentle care he needed. When the Mustang was finally settled in, Diane turned to Marco, her expression soft but firm. "We'll take it from here," she said. "He's going to need time, but he's strong. He'll get through this." Marco stood there for a long moment, watching the Mustang, who had begun to nuzzle at the hay in the corner of his stall. It was a quiet moment, one that spoke volumes. The Mustang had made it this far, and now it was time for him to take the next step in his recovery. Marco took a deep breath, his emotions a mixture of relief and sadness. He had given everything to get the Mustang here, and now he had to let go. But the bond between them wouldn't disappear. It couldn't. "I'll be back," Marco whispered, more to himself than to the horse. "I'll check in. You're not alone." And as he turned to leave, he knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of another journey, for both of them. The next few weeks felt like an odd, disconnected blur. Marco tried to immerse himself in the quiet routine of life, but his thoughts were never far from Storm. Each day he would return to his small cabin, rest, and go over what needed to be done. But the image of the Mustang's dark eyes stayed with him. Even the mundane tasks, feeding himself, taking care of his own needs, felt distant, as though he was moving through life with a weight on his shoulders that he couldn't shake. In the mornings, he would drive out to the rehabilitation center, the landscape around him slowly recovering from the floods. The once raging river was calm now, its waters having receded, leaving behind only the remnants of destruction. The fields were still muddy, the land scarred by the flood, but it seemed as though nature was slowly healing itself, much like Storm. Every visit, Marco would stand outside the rehabilitation center, watching from a distance. The horses were being cared for, some grazing in the paddocks, others being guided gently by the staff as they worked with them. He could see Storm from where he stood, a dark shape moving across the field, his steps tentative but steady. It was clear that the Mustang was improving. He was walking more confidently now, though still slow and cautious. The staff at the facility had been patient with him, allowing him to regain his strength at his own pace. Diane, the lead trainer, had been kind and understanding, keeping Marco updated on Storm's progress and encouraging him to keep visiting. One morning, after weeks of feeling disconnected, Marco received a call that would change everything. Diane's voice came through the phone, clear and professional, but with a note of urgency. "Marco, I think it's time," she said. "Storm's making great progress. He's stronger now, more confident, but we need to take the next step. We're ready to begin working with him in the round pen. It's time for him to start reconnecting with his wild instincts, and we think you should be here." Marco's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment when the Mustang would begin to regain his spirit, to reclaim the strength he had lost. It was time for him to move forward, and it seemed that Marco too was being called to take the next step in this journey. "I'll be there," Marco said, his voice firm, though a bit shaken. When Marco arrived at the rehabilitation center later that morning, he could see Storm out in the large, enclosed, round pen. The Mustang's coat had started to regain its luster, and he no longer looked as frail. There was an energy to him now, a presence that Marco hadn't seen before. Storm stood tall, his dark eyes scanning the horizon, his muscles rippling with each movement. Diane was standing just outside the pen, her arms crossed, watching intently. When she saw Marco approach, she smiled. "He's ready for this," Diane said, her voice calm but filled with quiet pride. "He's come so far, but he still has a ways to go." Marco took a deep breath, stepping up to the edge of the round pen. His eyes locked with the Mustang's, and for a moment it was as if nothing had changed. It was just him and Storm, two survivors, two souls who had crossed paths by chance, but who had found a deeper connection. "Are you sure he's ready for this?" Marco asked, his voice almost hesitant. Diane nodded. "He's been through a lot, but he's stronger now. We've been gentle, but it's time to push him a little further. He needs to remember what it feels like to move with purpose, to reconnect with his instincts." Marco's gaze softened as he watched the Mustang. There was a flicker of something wild and free, beneath the surface of those dark eyes. It reminded him of the day they had first met, when Storm had been so desperate to fight the flood, to hold on to life. Now, the horse was standing tall, his posture proud, even though he was still recovering. Diane opened the gate to the round pen, allowing Marco to enter. The Mustang didn't flinch, but he didn't move forward either. He was still watching, calculating, figuring out whether this moment was another test or an opportunity. "Take it slow," Diane advised. "Let him approach you, don't rush it." Marco nodded, stepping slowly into the pen. His steps were deliberate, measured. He didn't want to scare Storm. The connection they shared was still delicate, like the fragile threads of a bond that had only just begun to form. He stopped a few feet away from the Mustang, crouching slightly. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that this was a moment they needed to navigate together. Storm, with all his wildness, needed to know he could trust Marco, and Marco needed to trust that Storm was ready to begin this next phase of his recovery. For what felt like an eternity, they simply stood there, eyes locked, both of them trying to understand the unspoken truth between them. Finally, Storm took a hesitant step forward, his hooves crunching softly in the dirt. His head was lowered slightly, his ears flicking back and forth. He didn't approach quickly, but there was no hesitation in his eyes. Slowly, methodically, the Mustang closed the distance between them, his powerful legs moving with a grace Marco had not expected. There was no sign of fear, no sign of hesitation now. It was as if the Mustang had made a choice, to trust, to allow Marco to be a part of his life once again. Marco extended his hand slowly, letting Storm approach at his own pace. When the Mustang finally reached him, he lowered his head, his nose grazing Marco's palm. The touch was gentle but deliberate, the horse acknowledging the bond that had been formed between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about understanding. Marco stroked the Mustang's neck, his heart swelling with emotion. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered, his voice thick with feeling. "You've come so far." Storm stood still for a moment longer, his body calm but alert, as if acknowledging the trust between them. He wasn't just the wild horse Marco had saved from the flood anymore. He was something more, something that had become a part of Marco's life, just as much as Marco had become a part of his. After a moment, Diane stepped forward, giving Marco some space to breathe. He's ready for the next stage now. It's time for him to relearn what it feels like to be free. Marco's hand lingered on the Mustang's neck as he nodded slowly. The pain of their shared struggle had brought them together, but it was the strength they had found in each other that had forged this bond. And now, it was time to let Storm take that first step toward the future, toward freedom, toward a life of his own making. "I'll always be here," Marco said quietly. "Whenever you're ready." Storm flicked his ears back in what seemed like acknowledgement. The Mustang turned his head, taking a few more steps away, before he suddenly broke into a slow trot, circling the round pen with a grace that Marco hadn't seen in him before. There was an undeniable sense of freedom in his movements, an echo of the wild spirit that had been buried under the weight of survival. Marco watched, his heart swelling with pride. Storm was reclaiming himself. He was reclaiming his strength. And in that moment, Marco realized that he wasn't just helping the Mustang heal. He was healing too. The Mustang stopped running and returned to Marco's side, standing quietly, his head slightly lowered in a gesture of trust. The journey wasn't over, but it had started something new for both of them. "Let's go home, Storm," Marco whispered. "We've got a lot to do, but we'll do it together." And with that, the Mustang, with his wild spirit still intact, stood beside Marco, a partner, a companion, a survivor. Together, they had overcome the storm. Together, they would face whatever came next. The days at the rehabilitation center passed in a blur of quiet moments, gentle progress, and subtle triumphs. Storm's recovery was no longer just about his physical strength, though that was improving rapidly, but about his emotional healing. With every day, the wild, untamed fire that had once burned fiercely in his heart began to resurface, and with it, a gentler, trusting side that Marco had seen flickering in those first quiet moments between them. Storm's days were spent in the large paddocks, where he could stretch his legs and feel the freedom he hadn't known for so long. He would gallop across the fields, his powerful body moving like a river, flowing, strong yet unchained. But unlike before, there was a sense of purpose now. His movements, though wild and untamed, were no longer out of fear. They were out of joy, out of life. Marco visited every morning, and although he had his own work to tend to, his thoughts never strayed far from the Mustang. He had found a rhythm, a new purpose in his life, and Storm had become a part of that rhythm. In many ways, it felt like the two of them were growing together, both learning how to trust again, both learning to embrace what came after the storm. On one particular morning, as Marco pulled into the familiar gravel lot outside the clinic, he could see Storm out in the distance. The Mustang was running across the pasture, his body moving with the kind of freedom Marco had seen in wild horses. But there was something different now. The wildness in Storm's eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet understanding of his place in the world. He had fought so hard to survive, but now he was learning what it meant to truly live. Marco climbed out of the truck and walked toward the paddock. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. There was no urgency in his step. Only the steady, quiet certainty that, for once, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Storm looked up as Marco approached, his ears flicking in recognition. Without hesitation, the Mustang trotted over, his gait slow but confident. He stopped, just a few feet away from Marco, standing still for a moment as they locked eyes. There was no fear in the horse now, just the quiet companionship that had been forged through so many days of struggle and survival. Marco held out his hand, slowly, giving Storm the space he needed to come closer. The Mustang nuzzled Marco's palm, and for the first time, there was no tension, no hesitation. It was as if Storm had finally embraced the fact that he wasn't alone anymore. He had made it through the worst, and so had Marco. Together, they had conquered the flood, and now, together, they were beginning to rebuild. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Marco murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I always knew you were strong, but this is something else." Storm's response was simple, a soft snort, followed by a gentle flick of his tail. There were no words needed between them. The connection was deep, a silent understanding that spoke louder than anything else. As Marco stood beside the Mustang, watching him graze peacefully in the sunlight, a thought struck him. This was healing. Not just for Storm, but for him as well. The journey had been difficult, filled with hardship and fear, but it had brought them to a place of quiet peace. It had allowed Marco to realize that there was strength in vulnerability, that true healing only came when you allowed yourself to be open, to let others in, to let them share in your pain and in your joy. Storm wasn't just an animal. He wasn't a creature to be tamed or fixed. He was a partner, a living being who had his own struggles, his own battles, but who had shown Marco what it meant to fight for something worth fighting for. For the first time in years, Marco felt at peace. The heavy weight that had been pressing on him for so long, the grief and the guilt that had lingered in the background of his mind seemed to dissipate in the presence of this quiet animal. Storm had shown him that even in the aftermath of pain, there was hope. Even after everything had been lost, something could still be rebuilt. It might not look the same as it had before, but that didn't make it any less valuable. Days turned into weeks, and Storm continued to grow stronger. His coat became sleek once again, his muscles firming up as he regained his strength. The once wild Mustang now stood tall and proud, his eyes still holding that untamed spirit. But now there was a gentleness to him, a willingness to trust in the care of the people around him. And Marco? Marco was no longer the man who had run away from his past. He was no longer the man who had closed off his heart, too afraid to care about anything or anyone. He had been given a second chance, not only by the Mustang, but by the simple act of caring for something other than himself. One afternoon, after weeks of watching Storm grow stronger, Marco stood at the edge of the paddock, his arms crossed as he observed the Mustang grazing in the sun. Diane had told him that Storm was ready for the next step, that it was time for him to return to the wild. It was a decision that weighed heavily on Marco's heart, but he knew it was the right one. Storm had come a long way. He had healed, physically, emotionally, and mentally. And now, it was time for him to return to the land he had known. He was no longer the frightened, vulnerable horse he had been when Marco had first pulled him from the flood. He had reclaimed his strength, his spirit, and he was ready to be free again. Marco stood there for a long time, the soft breeze ruffling his hair as he watched Storm move across the field. There was a sadness in his heart, yes, but it was accompanied by a profound sense of peace. He had done what he could for Storm. He had helped him find his way, just as Storm had helped Marco find his. "I'm proud of you," Marco whispered, his voice barely audible in the wind. "You've come so far." Storm paused for a moment, his ears flicking toward Marco. It was as if he had heard the words, understood them, and for a brief second their eyes met. There was no need for more words. The bond between them had already been forged, deep and unspoken. With a final glance, Storm turned and trotted toward the edge of the paddock, pausing at the gate. His head turned back toward Marco, and for a moment there was a flash of recognition in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of what they had shared. And then, just as easily, the Mustang turned and galloped away, his powerful body moving with the kind of freedom Marco had always known he deserved. Marco stood there, his chest tight as he watched Storm disappear into the distance, his heart swelling with pride, with love, and with an understanding that went beyond words. He had given the Mustang his second chance, and in doing so, he had given himself one as well. The Mustang would always be a part of him, just as Marco would always be a part of Storm. Their bond, born out of shared survival, had blossomed into something deeper, something more meaningful than either of them could have expected. And though they were now walking different paths, the lessons they had learned together would stay with them forever. For Marco, it was a reminder that no matter how deep the pain, there was always a way to heal. Even after everything had been lost, something new could grow from the ashes. And for the Mustang, it was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in fighting alone, but in finding the courage to trust, to let someone else in. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the field, Marco turned and walked back to his truck, his heart light. He was no longer running. He was moving forward. And in that moment, Marco knew that there was no storm, no flood, no hardship that could ever take away the lessons he had learned from the Mustang. They had survived, and they were both ready for the future.